To think you know Henry VIII is to think of the king with 6 wives, the founder of the Church of England, the monarch whose very image became synonymous with power. But the truth is far darker, far stranger, and far more grotesque than any textbook dares to reveal. Imagine a man whose very body had become a warning, decaying in real time, while an entire kingdom was forced to watch. A king whose flesh reeked so terribly that his own courtiers covered their faces in perfumed cloths just to survive an audience with him. By the final years of his reign, Henry VIII was less a ruler of men than a prisoner of his own collapsing body, a walking corpse whose every breath carried the stench of rot. The numbers alone are astonishing. At his peak, Henry's waist measured a staggering 54 inches. He weighed close to 400 pounds, in an era when the average Englishman weighed little more than 140. His bulk was so immense that mechanical devices had to be built to hoist him into the saddle, or to move him from chamber to chamber. To servants, dressing the king was less an act of ceremony than a punishment, because beneath his magnificent robes lay horrors that few dared to look upon. His legs were covered with ulcers festering, open wounds that refused to heal. They oozed pus and rotted flesh, filling the air with a stench so overpowering that it could be detected from several rooms away. Imagine the court of England, filled with music and chatter, suddenly falling silent as the king entered, not because of reverence, but because of the overwhelming odor that announced him. Attendants drew straws to decide who would stand closest to him, for proximity to the king meant proximity to sickness itself. Some fainted, some gagged, yet all endured, because turning away from Henry VIII was a death sentence of its own. This decay was not only physical, it was also symbolic. In Tudor England, illness was often seen as divine punishment, a sign of God's judgment. How could a king, who claimed to rule by divine right, suffer so terribly in his own flesh? Whispers spread through London. Perhaps Henry's rotting body was a reflection of his rotting soul. Perhaps England itself, fractured by religious upheaval and political executions, was decaying with him. But the story of Henry's downfall cannot be told without the catastrophe of 1536. That year, during a jousting tournament, the king was struck with such force that he was thrown violently from his horse. He lay unconscious for 2 long hours, so long that many thought England had lost its sovereign. When he awoke, he was not the same man. The confident young monarch, once admired for his athleticism and charm, seemed to vanish overnight. In his place emerged a creature of rage, suspicion, and cruelty. Modern medicine gives us clues that Tudor physicians could not. Scholars now suspect that the accident caused a traumatic brain injury, altering Henry's personality and accelerating his decline. Some believe he may also have suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a disorder of the adrenal glands that could explain his uncontrollable weight gain, mood swings, and the ulcers that plagued his legs. But to his contemporaries, such explanations were unthinkable. To speak of the king's weakness was treason. To suggest he was ill was to risk the axe. His doctors, trained more in superstition than science, offered only flattery, never truth. They prescribed poultices and herbs, prayers and charms, but dared not name what was evident to all. England's monarch was falling apart, cell by cell, wound by wound. What made it more grotesque was the contrast. Henry had once been the embodiment of Renaissance vitality. Tall, broad-shouldered, skilled in music, hunting, sport. In his youth, ambassadors described him as a prince so handsome and full of vigor that he seemed touched by God. Now, that same body had turned traitor, becoming a theatre of horror for everyone forced to serve him. His flesh sagged, his wounds festered, and every movement reminded his kingdom that no amount of power, wealth, or divine claim could save a man from the slow corruption of disease. And yet, Henry himself seemed blind to this transformation. He raged against servants who recoiled at his odor, punished courtiers who whispered of his weakness, and convinced himself that he remained the chosen vessel of God's will. But beneath the jeweled crown and the silken robes was a man already decomposing while still alive, a king who had become, quite literally, a warning of mortality. This is where our story begins, not with the mighty conqueror of France, nor the brilliant young monarch of the early 1502, but with a bloated, festering figure who could barely walk, whose very presence turned banquets into charnel houses. By the end of his life, Henry VIII was not simply a king, he was a corpse in waiting, a body rebelling against the throne it carried. And in that rebellion lay the seeds of terror, paranoia, and cruelty that would define the rest of his reign. If Henry's body had already become a prison of rotting flesh, then his mind, after the fateful jousting accident of 1536, was a labyrinth of shadows. Before that day, he had been the picture of a Renaissance prince, tall, athletic, charming, fluent in music, languages, and sport. But when the horse crushed him and he lay unconscious for 2 long hours, something deep inside fractured. When he opened his eyes again, the kingdom did not regain the king. It had lost it, inherited a monster. The change was so dramatic that even hardened courtiers whispered about it behind closed doors. The laughter was gone, replaced by suspicion. The warmth of his early years had curdled into cruelty. He raged without warning, his temper flaring at imagined slights. A sideways glance, an unguarded phrase, even the echo of a dream could provoke a death sentence. In these moments his swollen face turned crimson, his foul breath reeking from infected wounds, his eyes bulging with a hatred that seemed less than human. Those who had once adored him now bowed in terror, never knowing if they would rise again. Modern historians have drawn grim parallels, like Caligula of Rome, whose illness drove him into madness, or even the Terrible of Russia, whose grief and trauma unleashed rivers of blood. Henry too became a cautionary tale of power twisted by injury and illness. Doctors today suspect a traumatic brain injury or Cushing's syndrome, conditions unknown in Tudor medicine but devastating in their effects. Wild mood swings, paranoia, uncontrollable appetites. Yet no physician dared speak the truth. To admit the king was broken would mean their own execution. Instead, they offered meaningless poultices and whispered prayers, hoping that silence might save their necks. But silence could not save the women who shared his throne. To be Henry's queen was not a privilege, it was a death sentence waiting to be signed. Anne Boleyn, once the dazzling object of his obsession, was destroyed by the same passion that had elevated her. When Henry tired of her, he did not simply discard her. He orchestrated a theatre of cruelty. Accusations of adultery, even with her own brother, were dragged from tortured confessions. One by one, 5 men were executed for crimes they never committed, while Anne was forced to watch, knowing she would follow them to the block. Her execution was not justice. It was Henry's paranoia given form, the blade of the sword carrying out the whims of a deranged monarch. Then came Catherine Howard, barely more than a child when she was married to the bloated, ulcer-ridden king. Her crime was not treason or betrayal of the crown, but merely her past, innocent relationships from before her marriage. Henry, consumed by jealous rage, turned her into a symbol of his vengeance. He did not just execute her, he changed the law itself, declaring that anyone who failed to reveal their sexual history before marrying him had committed treason. Imagine the pettiness of a man so obsessed with his wounded pride that he rewrote the very fabric of the kingdom's justice to satisfy his humiliation. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, suffered perhaps the cruelest exile of all. Once beloved, she was cast aside like an old garment when she could no longer provide Henry with a son. Forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary, isolated in damp castles, she wasted away in despair, writing letters to Henry that were never answered. Rumours whispered she may have been poisoned. Her lonely death, the final act of a betrayal that began when Henry defied the Pope himself just to be rid of her. Anne of Cleves was spared the axe but not the humiliation. Henry found her unattractive, mocking her appearance cruelly, and demanded an annulment. Terrified, she agreed, thanking him for the privilege of being cast aside rather than executed. Jane Seymour, hailed as the lucky wife, died only days after giving Henry his long-awaited son, and yet Henry's grief was so shallow that within 9 days of her funeral he was already negotiating his next marriage. For him, wives were not partners or companions, they were disposable objects, tools in a desperate game to produce heirs and satisfy his vanity. None of these women had any chance of escape. Divorce was not an option. Flight meant death. Resistance meant not only their own execution but the ruin of their families. They lived trapped in palaces that felt more like prisons, waking each day not knowing if they would see the night. For Henry, marriage was another battlefield, and he wielded love like a weapon sharper than any sword. But Henry's appetite for destruction was not limited to women or courtiers. It extended to food, to power, to life itself. If Henry devoured his wives with suspicion and cruelty, he devoured food with equal ferocity. His banquets were not meals, they were spectacles of excess, performances of gluttony designed to remind the world that he was not just a king but a force of appetite itself. By the final decade of his reign, he was consuming nearly 5,000 calories a day, more than double the needs of an active soldier. And Henry was no soldier by then. He was a man who could barely move without help, his bloated body hauled about in specially designed chairs while kitchens roared to life to satisfy his endless hunger. Picture the scene. Entire pigs, roasted whole, carried into the hall on silver platters, mountains of bread stacked higher than a man's chest, chickens, swans, and deer laid out as though the forests of England had been emptied for his pleasure. Bowls of oysters, platters of fish, tarts dripping with sugar, rivers of red wine flowing until the stone floors themselves seemed to shimmer. This was not the diet of a king, it was the diet of a man trying to consume the world itself. And yet, it was not only the amount that was grotesque, it was the ritual. Every bite that passed Henry's lips had first been tasted by others, sometimes more than once, for he was consumed by fear of poison. He would not touch a dish until 30 minutes had passed, just to see if the servant who tested it fell dead. His paranoia turned dining into theatre, courtiers forced to stand and watch, hour after hour, as their king chewed his way through enough food to feed a village. The smell of roasted meat mixed with the stench of his infected wounds. The gleam of gold chalices contrasted with the dull grey of his swollen, ulcerated legs hidden under the table. The kitchens of Henry's palaces were empires in themselves. Over 200 servants laboured each day to prepare nearly 800 dishes, though most went untouched. Fires burned ceaselessly, spit boys turned roasting racks until their arms ached, and butchers carved through carcasses with the precision of surgeons. Feeding Henry was not nourishment, it was industry, politics, survival. For the entire household, hunger was the king's alone to satisfy. And Henry was not content with ordinary food. He believed that what he ate could reshape him. Swans for grace, venison for hunting prowess, oysters for vigour in the marriage bed. It was a medieval superstition turned into obsession, as though feasting on the flesh of animals might grant him the qualities his decaying body could no longer provide. But no matter how much he consumed, he remained less a lion than a bloated relic, his table groaning under the weight of a fantasy he could never live again. In a cruel twist of irony, Henry despised the food of common people. Barley, turnips, peas, foods that might have preserved his health were banned from his table, not because of their taste, but because they were unfit for a king. He dined on the rare and the rich, blind to the fact that every bite hastened his decline. His waist expanded, his ulcers deepened, his breath grew fouler, yet still he ate, convinced his royal blood rendered him immune to the consequences that ordinary mortals faced. But food was never just food for Henry, it was power. To watch him eat was to watch a kingdom groan beneath the weight of its master. His paranoia demanded that meals be guarded, kitchens locked, ingredients tested for treachery. Salt, water, wine, all were examined for signs of poison. The act of eating became a ritual of dominance, each bite proof that no assassin had bested him, each swallow an affirmation that he still lived, still ruled, still commanded fear. And yet beneath the gold and silver, beneath the endless platters of roasted flesh, there was always the same truth. The king was killing himself. His appetite was a weapon turned inward, carving him apart more efficiently than any sword. His throne may have stood secure, but his body was already betraying him, collapsing under the weight of its own excess. Still, his fear of betrayal was greater than his fear of death, and as his hunger grew, so too did his paranoia. He no longer trusted his people, his servants, even his children. Henry VIII had become not only the most gluttonous man in Europe, but also the most suspicious. And it was that suspicion fermenting alongside his rotting flesh that would transform his kingdom into a nightmare of spies, daggers, and shadows. If Henry's banquets displayed his hunger for flesh, then his court revealed his hunger for control. By the last decade of his reign, the great halls of England had become theatres of fear. The once magnificent king who danced and jousted now shuffled through palaces transformed into prisons, where every whisper was a potential dagger and every smile a mask concealing treason. He trusted no one. Not his wives, not his friends, not even his children. The very air in his chambers seemed thick with suspicion. Guards were stationed outside his bedchamber doors day and night, their halberds gleaming in torchlight, not only to protect him from assassins, but also to remind courtiers that their every move was watched. Henry himself rarely slept soundly. At his bedside were always loaded crossbows, pistols, and swords, an arsenal fit not for a king but for a man at war with ghosts. Some nights he ordered servants to sit silently in the shadows of his chamber, their task not to serve but simply to prove they existed should he wake suddenly, terrified of being alone. The network of spies he built rivaled anything seen in Europe. Letters were intercepted, conversations reported, secret alliances exposed. Informants slithered through taverns, markets, even the kitchens of noble households, feeding the king's paranoia with tales many invented of betrayal. Henry rewarded such whispers with gold, land, or titles, which only encouraged more lies. Truth became irrelevant. Fear became the only currency that mattered. To speak carelessly in England was to gamble with one's head. Even the highest-born men were not safe. Once loyal advisers, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, were reduced to heads on spikes. Noblemen who had feasted beside Henry one month were dragged to the Tower the next, accused of treason on evidence as fragile as rumour. Some were executed simply for knowing too much, others for being too popular, their loyalty irrelevant. For Henry, every subject was a potential traitor, every friend a possible assassin. He ruled not by love but by terror, and the axe was his most reliable instrument of state. The terror seeped into daily life. Ordinary people learned to guard their tongues, to cross themselves when the king's name was spoken, to avoid speaking of politics even in whispers. The nation itself became an echo of Henry's mind, paranoid, suspicious, fearful. Where once England had dreamed of Renaissance glory, it now lived in a waking nightmare, where the will of one man dictated who lived and who died, who rose and who fell. And yet, for all the weapons by his bed, for all the spies in his service, Henry could never escape the enemy he feared most, himself. His paranoia was not only political but personal. He imagined betrayal in the eyes of his wives, treason in the laughter of his children, conspiracy in the loyalty of his ministers. Even as his body decayed, his suspicion grew sharper, cutting deeper than any blade. By the end, Henry VIII no longer resembled a king at all. He was a swollen carcass of power, rotting from within, surrounded by trembling servants too afraid to speak the truth. His palaces, once filled with music and dancing, now echoed with silence, broken only by the shuffle of guards and the groans of a man who trusted no one and loved nothing except his throne. But the tragedy of Henry's paranoia is not only what it did to him, it is what it did to England. The culture of fear he nurtured, the executions he demanded, the betrayals he forced, left scars on the kingdom that would not heal for generations. He had torn down monasteries, executed nobles, discarded wives, alienated Rome, and left his children with a throne as poisoned as his own body. Henry VIII had devoured not only food, not only wives, not only friends, he had devoured England itself. By the final years of Henry's reign, his body had become the perfect mirror of his rule, swollen, diseased, collapsing under its own weight. The once towering figure who had thundered across jousting fields now could not climb a staircase without groaning, could not rise from his throne without attendants hauling him up like a sack of grain. His legs, ulcerated and infected, oozed pus and blood through the bandages wrapped around them. The stench was unbearable. Courtiers spoke of a smell so foul it filled entire chambers, clinging to the tapestries, souring the air. To serve near the king was to endure not only his temper but the reek of his rotting flesh. Doctors tried everything. They lanced the ulcers, applied poultices, smeared concoctions of herbs and oils across his festering skin. Nothing worked. Henry screamed at them, accused them of incompetence, sometimes even of treachery, convinced they were conspiring to hasten his death. But the truth was simpler. No medicine could heal a man who had eaten himself into ruin, who had poisoned his own body with gluttony and rage. His obesity grew monstrous. He exceeded 400 pounds, his once broad frame now a prison of fat. Doors had to be widened, chairs reinforced, clothing specially made to encase his vast bulk. He could not mount a horse, he could not dance. Even standing for more than a few minutes was agony. The king who had once dazzled Europe with his vitality now sat immobile, glaring at a world that had watched him decay, and yet his hunger never faded. Even as his body failed, he demanded more food, more wine, more indulgence. Feasts continued, though he could barely stomach what he ordered. Platters of roasted meat were carried into his chamber, though much of it went untouched, left to rot while peasants starved beyond his palace walls. Still, he insisted on the display, for the sight of abundance mattered more than the taste. The ritual of gluttony was all that remained of the lion who once devoured life itself. But it was not only food he craved, it was control. Henry signed death warrants until his hand trembled, sending men and women alike to the scaffold in his final years. Each execution was both punishment and reassurance, a reminder to himself that he still ruled, that his word still held the power of life and death. Yet in truth, he was a king imprisoned by his own body, a monarch whose kingdom shrank each day to the size of his fetid bedchamber. By 1547, Henry was a shadow of the man who had once reshaped England with fire and fury. His mind wandered, slipping in and out of lucidity. At times he muttered to himself, at others he raged uncontrollably, hurling curses at servants too terrified to answer. His eyes, once blazing with confidence, now stared hollowly, as though he were haunted by the ghosts of those he had destroyed: wives, friends, ministers, monks, nobles. The Tower of London was full of bones, and Henry's conscience, though he denied it, could not silence their whispers. When death finally came, it was slow and grotesque. He lay bloated in his bed at Whitehall Palace, sores weeping, skin mottled, his breathing laboured. He had become so heavy that it took a system of pulleys to move him. Those who attended him reported that his body seemed to collapse under itself, the very flesh dissolving into decay before life had fully left him. His physicians dared not tell him he was dying, for fear of his wrath. Only when he fell into a stupor, gasping for air, did priests finally whisper prayers over his failing body. And when his last breath escaped, the silence that followed was not reverence, but relief. England, long held hostage by his paranoia, gluttony, and cruelty, exhaled with him. Yet the stench of his death lingered literally. Legend has it that Henry's corpse, so swollen with decay, burst open in its coffin, leaking onto the church floor. To those who hated him, it was divine justice, the final humiliation of a king who had consumed everything except his own mortality. But Henry's death did not end his shadow. He left behind a kingdom fractured by religious division, a court steeped in suspicion, children destined to fight for the throne he had so violently guarded. His body rotted in the earth, but the scars of his reign remained etched into England's soul. Henry VIII had devoured wives, friends, nobles, and food. In the end, he devoured himself. And in that grotesque consumption lay the true legacy of England's most infamous king. Not glory, not greatness, but the warning that power, unchecked, is nothing more than a feast that ends in rot.